Hello and welcome. My name is Larry Edelson. I am the new Artistic and General Director of Opera Saratoga, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to this very special event exploring adapting William Kennedy's Roscoe for the opera stage. This particular event, I'm really excited that it's my first event that I get to host in my new position here. As some of you know, I have a very strong personal interest and background in developing new works for the opera stage. So when I learned that Roscoe, the workshop, was being scheduled as part of the recently completed summer festival, I was very excited. The workshop that was done here at Skidmore was a tremendous success, and it was so amazing to see this work coming to life for the first time. And I was also particularly excited that Opera Saratoga was partnering with Skidmore to bring this work to life for the community. Composer Evan Mack and librettist Joshua McGuire, who are here with us this evening, are a very gifted writing team that have taken on an extraordinary challenge: adapting William Kennedy's Roscoe for the opera stage. That is no easy task. Now, William Kennedy hardly needs an introduction. A Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist, I'm not sure that anything I could say would provide much insight into his extraordinary career. And instead of giving you biographical information, which many of you already know much better than I do, I thought that in the context of tonight's event, I'd share a quote that I recently read about Bill's beloved Albany cycle. In Kennedy's Albany, everyone knows everyone else, even if they don't know themselves. They have been cheating and screwing one another for decades, one way or another. They know each other's bloodlines, alliances, vices, secret lyricisms, schemes for survival or success. This kind of sounds like opera to me. With this in mind, I certainly can understand why Evan and Josh thought that one of Bill's novels might make a great opera. So it is my pleasure and my honor to introduce William Kennedy and to begin our evening with a reading from Roscoe. William.
My connection to this opera, which we're about to hear a few fragments of, is a novel, Roscoe, that I finished 5 years ago, and which took me 40 years to write, accumulate and write. The novel caught the fancy of composer Evan Mack, and he came to me and asked if I'd be interested in making it into an opera. I've been listening to Pavarotti and Caruso and U.C. Björling and John McCormick for years, singing arias from the great operas, but I had no experience whatsoever with opera as a performance art. Nevertheless, I told Evan I'd welcome my story being told in another artistic form. Is this good? Can everybody hear me? Music is a major element in my life and plays a significant role in much of my fiction. I've also said that my novel Roscoe seemed a perfect fit because of the emotional heights and depths to which opera generally carries a character's life. My hero, Roscoe Conway, is a man of excessive behavior, and his emotions in the book are a roller coaster adventure. Larry Edelson has already told you about these people who are structuring the novel into an opera, and I think that they are doing admirably what I've read of it so far and what I've heard. I am thrilled by the experience. I know that they're trying to bring out the complex people in the novel through musical dialogue, and they're trying to bring out the high drama of these lives and stay true to the underlying quality of the political life of this story. And underlying quality is that the political life is hilarious. Roscoe Conway is the #2 man in the Albany County Democratic Party, which is what they used to call the political machine that ran the city and county of Albany. Those fellows took City Hall in 1921, and their heirs haven't let go of it yet. We're only 7 years away right this minute from Albany's centennial in Democratic hands, an unparalleled span of power in the history of American politics. In the Albany of 2014, we're well into an era of pluralism, even to the point of now having a woman mayor, Kathy Sheehan. The old boss of the machine, Dan O'Connell, his position on that sort of thing was that a woman's place is in the kitchen. But the party, as it existed in the early 1920s, was a boss machine, and that's what Dan was. And that's what Patsy McCall is in Roscoe. A non-Perel construct that ruled and plundered many American cities in that era. My novel tells the story of how this political machine came into being and how, one way or another, it managed to win every election that came along, from 1921 to the 1980s, when the machine began to disintegrate. In the 80s, they still won the elections. It was no longer the same old machine. In my novel, a triumvirate rules the machine: the boss, Patsy McCall, and then Roscoe, #2, and he administers the party's workings. And then there's a third man, Elisha Fitzgibbon, a wealthy industrialist whose son is the mayor of Albany. Elisha is married to Veronica Morgan, a beauty whom, in their young days, Elisha stole from Roscoe. The two men remain friends despite this, and Roscoe also continues to love Veronica, and some of that story will be played out tonight by our wonderful singers, Mitchell and Jessica. Roscoe lives alone in the city's biggest hotel, the Tenike, just as his father did for much of his life. Roscoe is weary, and he has decided to quit politics. And he's sitting here in the lobby now thinking of how he'll break this news to his partners, Patsy and Elisha. He sits in the corner of the lobby where his father used to hold court, and he stares across time to commune with his old man about what it meant to be a politician. Roscoe remembers his father entertaining a visitor in this lobby in 1917. Roscoe's father is Felix Conway, a man of 65, with a full gray beard down to his chest, hiding his necktie. He's wearing a waistcoat, suit coat, overcoat, and cap. But he also covers himself with a blanket to fend off the deadly springtime drafts in the hotel lobby. Felix had been a political hero and conqueror thrice elected mayor of Albany, and he also made a sizable fortune brewing and selling beer. He was kicked out of City Hall in 1893 after a lawsuit over voting fraud, but the Democrats regained City Hall in the next election, and they kept it for 5 years. Felix became the party's elder statesman with an office in City Hall right next to the new mayor. He also set up his private political shop in this lobby of the new Tenike Hotel. Roscoe, spanning these years now, sees him receiving a steady, life-giving flow of pals and pals and has-beens and would-bes, and bellhops daily place reserved signs on the marble tea table in the Empire armchair and sofa in the Conway corner of the lobby. The Republicans in this year have taken over the city, and they're well entrenched and very secure in their power. The Democrats no longer even try to win, just like the Republicans did in the old days. That's because now the Democratic boss, Packy McCabe, realizes that it's more profitable to play the loser and take Republican handouts for this pose. Yet Democratic reform elements endure. And the new generation always looks to Felix for wisdom on how to find their way back to City Hall. At the moment, Felix is in his chair, giving an audience to Eddie McDermott, leader of yet another reform faction that hopes to overthrow Packy McCabe's useless minority faction in the next Democratic primary election. Eddie stares into Felix's eye, revealing his plans to reform the party if he wins the primary, and to reform the city if he wins the election. Eddie leans farther and farther forward as he speaks ever so softly to Felix, finally rolling off the sofa onto one knee to make his message not only sincere but genuflectional. And he whispers to the Solomon of Albany politics, "You do want the Democrats to make a comeback and take City Hall again, don't you, sir?" "Oh, I do, says Felix. And he truly does. "I have much to learn, Mr. Conway, but there's one thing I can learn only from you, for nobody else has an answer, and I've asked them all." "What might that be, Mr. McDermott?" "Well, once we take over the party, how do we get the money to run it?" Felix Conway throws his arms wide, kiting his blanket toward the outer lobby. He opens both his coats, pulls off his muffler the better to breathe, and he begins to laugh. "He wants to know how you get the money," Felix says aloud. And then, as his laughter roars out of control, he rises from his chair and he shouts out to one and all, "How do you get the money? Oh, my Jesus, how do you get the money?" And then the laughter, paroxysmal now, seals Felix's throat and bloats him with its containment, and he floats up from his chair, still with a smile as wide as his head, and he rises like a hot air balloon, caroming off the balustrade of the Tennessee marble stairway, and he keeps rising up to collide with the lobby's French chandelier, where he explodes in a final thunderclap of a laugh, sending crystal shards raining down onto the hotel guests and Eddie McDermott, the terrified reformer below. Felix declares his principles. "How do you get the money, boy? When you run candidates for office and they win, you charge them a year's wages. Keep the city tax low, but if you have to raise it, call it something else. The city can do without vice, can't do without vice. So pinch the pimps and milk the madams. Anybody that sells the flesh, tax them. People who want city business, 30% back to us. Maintain the streets and sewers, but don't overdo it. Well-lit streets discourage sin, but don't overdo it. If they play craps, poker, or blackjack, cut the game. If they play faro or roulette, cut it double. Opium is the opiate of the depraved, but if they want it, see that they get it, and tax those low-life bastards. If they keep their dance halls open 24 hours, tax them twice. If they run a gyp joint, tax them triple. If they send prisoners to our jail, charge them rent at hotel prices. Keep the cops happy and let them have a piece of the pie, a small piece. Never buy anything that you can rent forever. If you pave a street, a 3-cent brick should be worth 30 cents to the city. Pave every street with a church on it. Cultivate priests and acquire the bishop. Encourage parents to send their kids to Catholic schools. It keeps down the public school budget. When in doubt, appoint another judge and pay him enough so as you don't have to shake down the lawyers. Cultivate lawyers. They know how it is done, and they will do it. Control the district attorney and never let him go, for he controls the grand juries. Make friends with millionaires and give them what they need. Any traction company is a good traction company. And the same goes for electricity. If you build a viaduct, make the contractor your partner. Whenever you confront a monopoly, acquire it. Open an insurance company and make sure anybody doing city business buys a nice policy. If you don't know diddle about insurance, open a brewery and make them buy your beer. Give your friends jobs, but at a price, and make new friends every day. Let the sheriff buy anything he wants for the jail. Never stop a ward leader from stealing. It's what keeps him honest. Keep your plumbers and electricians working, and remember it takes 3 men to change a wire. Republicans are all right as long as they're on our payroll. A city job should raise a man's dignity, but not his wages. Anybody on our payroll, high or low, pays his dues 3% of his salary, which is nice. But if they're on that new civil service and won't pay and you can't fire them, transfer them to the dump. If you find people who like to vote, let them. Don't be afraid to spend money for votes on election day. It's a godsend to the poor and good for business. But make it old bills, 1s and 2s, or they get suspicious. And only give them out in the river wards, never uptown. If an uptown voter won't register Democrat, raise his taxes. If he fights the raise, make him hire one of our lawyers to reduce it in court. Once it's lowered, raise it again next year. Knock on every door and find out if they're sick or pregnant or simple-minded and vote them. If they can breathe, take them to the polls. If they won't go, threaten them. Find out who's dead and who's dying, which is just as good as dead, and vote them. There's a hell of a lot of dead out there, and they never complain. The opposition might cry fraud, but let them prove it after the election. People say voting the dead is immoral, but what the hell? If they were alive, they'd all be Democrats. Just because they're dead don't mean they're Republicans. Thank you.
So I think the first clip we're going to see from the opera is the correlative passage where Felix declares his principles to Roscoe, and it's a really great example of what a librettist has to do when he sets out to write a libretto, which is to completely destroy the original prose that you just heard. I'll explain how I destroyed it specifically. Evan and I sat down to this passage originally and said, what are we going to to do. And Evan said, the great way to sort of cue that Felix is of the late 19th century and is completely corrupt, but you're supposed to laugh at him. I said, I want to do a Gilbert and Sullivan patter song. So think, I am the very model of a modern major general, So it'll be a little cue to everybody, what's going on, this enormous backstory, and we're going to just shorthand it. And so then my unenviable job was to take that amazing bit of prose, which you just heard, which of course has a rhythmic life all its own, and has all these musical subtleties built into it, and make it into something that is very slavish meter and, glib rhyme, and it sounds like a Gilbert and Sullivan patter song. So this is the result. Enjoy.
Sat in this corner. It was my father's corner. My father, a three-time mayor, the Solomon of Albany, unseated, disgraced, but here the authority. Will I become my old man, or just an old man? If I could ask him how to leave our corner, I would.
If Albany is to become a democratic town, you must know what is kept inside the head that wears the crown. Keep taxes low enough that the public doesn't gripe, but bear in mind it takes 12 city men to fix a pipe. Charge your friends for jobs, make a new friend every day. A city job should raise a man's esteem but not his pay. If Albany is to remain a democratic town, you must know what to stop inside the judge's gown. Keep payoffs in old bills and only pay in ones and twos, and when a Democrat's in court, you'll find he cannot lose. If a judge has money tucks behind the bedroom door, make sure he knows how fast the news can hit the newsroom door. How do you get the money? If they play poker, craps, or blackjack, you're caught in the game. To dose your town with milk and honey. If they play roulette, you cut the game double. My boy, you've got to get the money. Opium is the opiate of the depraved, but if they want it, let them have it. The tax goes low like bastards. You got to get the money, cause it's how you run the show. If Albany is to remain a democratic town, you buy the votes in ones and twos and never buy a town. Keep wars and cards and dancing joints and only them at night. Only halfway hit from you and then you tax them twice. Pave every street that has a church and street lamps by the bunch. But well-lit streets discourage since it never do too much. Make friends with millionaires and then you give them what they need. Keep everyone in business and you tax them till they bleed.
Now that I recall it as a lawyer should, I must say my old man knew how to run this town.
How do you get the money? If an uptown voter won't become a Democrat, he'll raise his taxes. To toss your town with milk and honey. If he fights the race, make him hire one of our lawyers to reduce it in court. My boy, you've got to get the money. Raise it slower to be too upset, he'll raise it again next year. You've got to get the money, cause it's how you buy the vote. If Albany is gonna be a Democratic town, you must know how it's done when an election's carried out. You knock on every door, and if they're free, then they can vote. And once it's in the ballot box, you fence it when they vote. Remember, not every station is full. So when you train your families, vote the names of their deceased, and vote them in the service of a great republic son. Just because they're dead doesn't mean they're Republican.
So, Josh, I'm going to ask you, because some of we couldn't read the super titles super well in that video, but can you recite a little bit of that text for us, and then talk a little bit about how you created a structure that would work musically, because of course in opera it has to work with music rather than work in a narrative flow on the page in a book.
Sure. Well, for me, the cardinal rule throughout this whole process has been to use as many of Bill's lines as is humanly possible and work them in, because they're better than mine. That is the obvious fact of the business. And so the first thing I did was sort of to scan that original passage and take out things that were roughly the right line length for a patter song. And then, of course, I had to work them into these rhyming couplets. So make friends with millionaires, and then you give them what they need. You know, you give them more stuff, then you tax them till they bleed, or something like that. And so it's, the cheekiness is inherent in that. And then, of course, it wouldn't be cheeky at all. It would just be a destruction of the original if the music weren't there. And so Evan can maybe talk a little bit about how you worked that.
So when I saw it, especially if the other thing is, this is a 21st century patter song. So we're writing in the style of Gilbert and Sullivan, but we're not Gilbert and Sullivan. So one of the things actually we did was sort of put it on steroids in the sense, and actually made it a vocal tap dance. So when you heard that refrain, you know, how do you get the money? And then that's where we lifted right from the book, and he could speak that text. So you get the inherent comedy in it, but it has to be married to the form of a patter song. So the other thing that, something like that with such list of things that are you doing, you know, it has to unfold over a fixed amount of time. It's, you know, unlike the novel where you can chew on it and go back, you have to have other devices to get you through. So by repeating, if Albany is to remain a democratic town, it focuses up, and then wait for it, here's the punchline. Or how do you get the money? Wait for it. You know, so we have these vocal clues musically and rhetorically that clue the audience in to get the most out of it, you know, because it goes so fast. You know.
Well, one of the questions I always ask a writing team when they come to me and they want to adapt a book into an opera is, why opera? You know, what is it about the source material that really begs to be made into an opera rather than perhaps be a movie or some other theatrical form of expression like a play or a musical? So can you speak to what was it about Roscoe that said this has to be an opera for us? Well,
actually for me, you know, reading it, I've been lucky a few times to go with your gut, and after reading Roscoe, you know, it jumped out and said, this is an opera. And the main thing was actually the musical language that Bill references throughout the novel, even at the end, you know, because a lot of the story has to do with love and death, which there are many famous operas about that, and even the final scene with the night boat, which is, you know, the last page of the book, when Roscoe steps on the night boat, he's hearing this Wagner prelude of some sort. So clearly, love and death throughout, and instantly I hear Wagner, and which clued me in instantly on how to write the overture or the opening, because I said, okay, this really confirms that it's, you know, this can be an opera, and so these larger-than-life characters really work. And I also found that you could get the essence of the novel, but the music could share some of the narrative and create another kind of depth to it to give it really a new perspective. And that's sort of how it came about on my end. You know.
One of the things that struck me when I read it too was that it has so many characters, and there's actually so many characters that don't make it into the opera. But the time worlds exist in this big sort of, it's more or less of a line and more of a spiral. You know, and so when you have to sort of hammer that into a linear shot for the opera stage, you have a lot of places to pull from, and you have a little more liberty than if the novel takes one linear trip and then you have to take a different one, you know, which is less good. The novel sort of has this swirling quality to it, and so one of the things that we've done in the opera is to answer that spatially, so that if, for instance, if a character is dead, and many of the characters, they see the deceased and they speak with them and they sort of appear as apparitions. Those would appear in a fully staged production, actually on like a sort of balcony or area. And you can have flashbacks. A character looks at a photograph and remembers something, and then that's happening on the left side of the stage and he's on the right side of the stage. And so we wanted to, opera as a form demands a kind of linearity, and yet we didn't want it to be tritely linear. We wanted to preserve some of that quality that's more spatial than linear, and that's more sort of swirling than walking in a straight line.
Well,
and it lent itself to that.
To add on to that, so, writing an opera, you're creating also a musical universe. And so one of the things for me, which was wonderful with this novel, because it was jumping back from all of these time periods, to start in 1945, when I started writing this, I had Glenn Miller on, on my Pandora radio, just going constantly, that sound world, to try to tap into that. Now, I'm not writing a jazz opera. It just has that veneer. But what was great, it wasn't just that. So like the Gilbert and Sullivan piece we referenced, I can easily jump to different time worlds musically to express those things. So it's looking at it through a lens and using all the different time worlds for a new musical palette of color as well.
Evan, I just want to follow up on that because, this first excerpt that we heard is inspired by Gilbert and Sullivan. You mentioned inspiration from jazz. There are a lot of different musical inspirations in this piece. How did all that come together and speak with your voice? So this is an Evan Mack opera, not a pastiche.
Yeah, great. Absolutely. So a lot of the times it's just, for me, it's hearing this stuff, having it in the ether, and then once I create a motive or a musical idea, then that takes its own life. So, and we can get a little bit later, but even the Wagner reference, for example, the opening of Tristan and Isolde, right? So I take something, and this is the overture. But it can't all be Wagner. And that instantly puts us in a different world. So part of the composing process was trying to navigate how these things work. But then this motive develops into its own thing. Or I'll show a little later with Veronica's character on what some of her things do with reclaiming youth and then how those characters deal with it. So many of these musical ideas just then become living and breathing within that framework that I created.
Well, one of the great challenges of any adaptation is the process of distilling the essence of a piece rather than trying to put the entire book. We were saying at dinner tonight, if you tried to create the entire book as an opera, it probably would be 5 or 6 days long. And we already have the Ring Cycle. We're not looking for a multi-evening event, at least not right now. Maybe that's your next project. But so my question for you is, how would you go about the process of creating a structure for the storytelling? You talked a little bit about how you're working with the language and drawing from the original language, but I'm interested more in the structure of the storytelling and honoring some of that structure from the original material, but making sure that it works in a theatrical context. And at the same time, you mentioned that there were a number of characters and events that don't end up in the opera. How do you decide what not to include? And are you petrified because you're cutting out Bill Kennedy's fantastic characters and events?
Yes, I live in constant terror of that. I think a librettist is a particular kind of writer who has to be free from writerly scruples of any kind. You have to just be willing to do that. It was hard especially because I think one of the ways Roscoe works is that it's not just a separate subplot that can be cleanly excised. A character, one of the great things about Bill's fiction is that a character is sort of like a little piece of glass that it's a prism. They all relate to all the others in a way by the time you're done. And so after you've read it, you have to be very conscientious about cutting. There's a level of minority that you cut. The minor characters go in a way, and then there are some fairly major ones that are going that are actually kind of compressed archetypally into some of our characters. So there may be 2 or 3 different characters in the novel who are prostitutes who are named, and we have one. Roscoe has 2 heart attacks in the book, and in the opera he has 1 heart attack. There's things like that I like to think of it. I'm going to be really, really, really slimy and say it's not cutting, it's compressing. But of course, there's a lot of cutting that goes on, and ultimately, I think for me, I never do anything that's not in pretty close contact with Evan, that the musical sense of timing and the musical sense of pacing has to determine that. Do we have room for that character to breathe on stage musically? And if not, then there's no literary argument for keeping them.
Well, and a lot of times with the idea of compression or the structures that we set up, I mean, for me, the benefit of, standard in opera, recitative and aria, right? So recitative, you get the plot, and aria, the emotional reflection. Since this is 1945, one of the things we've talked about are songs as well, and we're calling them songs, which is, obviously a borrowed language, but that, we were looking at some of these 1945 song structures to help these small forms carry us through a long form genre. And so sometimes that actually provided more clarity. So instead of like, oh my goodness, I have to get through all of these things and plot, like having the music do some of the lifting, it's two people lifting a table rather than one. And so that's where, in a sense, the opera was used to our advantage. And so, I think that's sort of how we've proceeded with those structures.
Well, now, as this is a Writers Institute event, I want to talk just a little bit more about your process before we get Jessica and Mitch to sing, because I know everyone's waiting to hear some more singing. We were talking again earlier today about the stages of writing a piece, from outlining to libretto to first draft. And as I'm sure with any form of writing, the outlining, the creating the architecture of something is so important. Can you talk about your personal process for outlining before you actually start putting words to page and music to page? As I like to say, people don't fall in love with an outline. It's a lot easier to change things at the outline stage, but once you start writing your fantastic song, if you find out too late in the process that it doesn't actually work in the context of the piece, it's a lot harder to sort of say, maybe we should cut it because it's such a great song. So talk about a little bit that process.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, Josh and I, actually, the tedious part was, and we would run a lot by Bill in the prelim or the outlining, and even writing every 2 scenes, we would go to Bill's house and go over these things. But a lot of times, it was really this back and forth of, all right, what's the streamlining of the narrative, and then how can we keep that swirling with these devices we created. So we really wanted to set up the strict rules of the dead exist on the balcony, and the flashbacks are over here, and they're of the same name, same likeness. We're very clear on that, different lighting cues to let those things happen, and that even if you can have things swirling around with dead and living, how does that provide the dramatic arc to unfold? For us, it was also nice that Opera Saratoga approached us early on in the process, so we only had a couple scenes written. So it was like, let's write, and knowing they were going to workshop just Act 1. So it's like, let's write one heck of an Act 1. And for us, it worked because it's a structure where we set up all of these dominoes. And then Act 2, it's just taking our finger and poking that first domino, and it's going to unfold. So really, I think actually Act 2, as we start to map that out, it's really based on all of the things we set up in Act 1. I mean, but there was a lot of back and forth, right, Josh? I mean,
Tremendous amount. I think one of the things that we do maybe a bit differently than other writing teams is there's not, I mean, in the olden days, say Boito sending a libretto to Verdi or Hofmannsthal sending a libretto to Strauss, like you literally just wrote it out like a play and sent it in the mail, and then the composer set that. And we don't ever work that way. We sketch and we talk it out and we chew on it and let it percolate, and we say, okay, in this scene this is going to happen. And then we sort of generate matter. And I generate some very, very rough lines to work with in stage direction, and Evan generates some very rough musical sketches. And we try to, either via Skype now or in person, let that combust, if you will. So that you can't really say, there's a famous opera, one of the last by Richard Strauss, called Capriccio, where the whole opera is about, does word or music come first? And so there's this Wort oder Ton, always saying word or music, word or music. And of course, naturally, Strauss, at the end of his long operatic career, leaves that question unanswered. And I like to think we leave that question unanswered. There have been times when I did write a scene, and Evan said it pretty straight. There have been times, actually, at least in our first opera, where Evan wrote a 2 or 3 minute piece of music and said, this is it. And I went and retrofitted lyrics to that, which is a little more torturous process. I wouldn't recommend that, really. But generally, it's somewhere in between. Roscoe has been altogether in between. The great thing is we have this third step in the process, which is being able to run everything by Bill. So I do my best. That gets filtered through the music. I revise that. Then we take that libretto to Bill, and he can turn some amazing little screws in that, and sort of really make those characters come alive. Because at the end of the day,
well, yeah, let me just to sing the Ballad of Legs Diamond from a little computer, and the music's playing in the house that Legs Diamond was killed. I still can't process that. It was phenomenal, you know. So what a filter, right? I mean, that's pretty incredible, you know. So yeah, we have that. Very, very lucky to have that. You know?
No, I love hearing you talk about your collaboration and that you are able to meet in person or Skype. I mean, what you're talking about, this back and forth, actually isn't that different than Verdi and Boito or Hofmannsthal and Strauss. We are very lucky to have their letters preserved, and they make fascinating reading if you ever want to read them. I mean, there was a period of time, for example, a libretto of Metastasio, that might have gotten set by 60 different composers that, you know, the librettist had nothing to do, maybe never even heard it. Mm-hmm. But this back and forth, I mean, you imagine what would it have been like if, you know, Verdi and Boito had Skype, and then we didn't have these letters to read about their history. It's really interesting to think in this day and age, how much are we going to know when 50 years down the line, and Roscoe's a tremendous hit, and we want to know about its creation. Yeah. You know, we're going to have to, you know, go into your hard drive archives and find all sorts of interesting things. So, so on that note, why don't we have some more singing?
Yes, great.
I'm very, very excited to introduce Jessica Jones and Mitchell Hutchings. Jessica and Mitchell were young artists with Opera Saratoga's Summer Festival this season. They were instrumental in the workshop process, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. We finished our season at the end of June. They went home, and then they just couldn't get enough of Saratoga Springs, so we brought them back for a night, literally. And why don't, Evan, why don't you set up what we're going to hear first? Or Joshua, why don't you set up what we're going to hear first?
All right. Are we going to hear Mitchell's aria first? Is that right? Yes. So this is see, and this is one of those moments when you have to sort of stop the novel's flow and do a stand-in plant aria, part of it, right, for opera. So the action stops. Roscoe has just been called to Elisha Fitzgibbon's steel mill, where Elisha has committed suicide. Part of Roscoe's job is to cover that fact up. But he takes a moment in the opera to sort of pause and reflect on really his best friend has just died, and what does that mean for the future of the party, and what does that mean for the future of the way they've conducted business. This is a good example, too, I think, of getting to hear a little bit of text, which is not my final answer. We had to have scores into Opera Saratoga. This is an early draft. I'm going to take about half of this text out, actually, just so you know. But enjoy.
But the music will stand. That's
yes. You're clear about that.
You're locked in now, Elijah, locked in this age. A politician doesn't answer the demands of the age with silence. This game won't allow you. A dealer can
great to hear you sing that again. And why don't we set up this next excerpt?
So the next thing we'll hear is an aria from Elisha's wife, Veronica. And this is, we wanted to sort of have a moment where she pauses and sort of absorbs the shock of his death. And in our initial discussions, Evan had said, I want to do something sort of like Goretzky here. If you know his music, he's sort of this Eastern European minimalist, very big, long, expansive lines. And that put a seed in my brain. And I started combing the passage of the novel, ran across this line that simply said, gone, gone, not gone, gone. And I thought, where's the musical progression in that? Departure and return. And I said, well, that's our word. You get a big vowel that you can play with. You can do whatever you want. And then I sort of fleshed that out. And so you'll hear her talk about how her husband has been taken and is gone. And then Roscoe comes to her house. And actually, Roscoe carries an old torch for Veronica. So there's a little bit of that. And he reveals to her that Elisha actually killed himself. She reveals to him that her sister, Pamela, is suing her for custody of Gilby, who is the boy that Veronica has raised, but is biologically Pamela's son. And so the whole thing gets terribly messy in Act 2, but this is the exposition of that.
Yeah. And very nice. But one other point is this is where musically where things can carry the narrative. So the idea is after the aria you just heard sung by Mitch, we get the first flashback, and you hear things like, or very, very pure music. So as this invention starts and then takes on its own life, when we see Veronica, and the first thing she's struggling is this idea of gone, it's like it sends this journey of do I recapture my youth and rekindle things with Roscoe, or continue on with the choices I've made 20 some odd years ago and protect my children. That some of these motives then creep in and out of all of the stuff you're going to hear. Sometimes it's her to let loose, and other times it boxes Veronica in. So here's Gone, and then the whole scene.
closing in, and Roscoe will know what to do. But I don't know.
The enemy, he knew.
Who is it?
Pamela, my rotten sister, wants to take Gilby back.
Pamela used to call, suing Veronica Fitzgibbon, for rightful custody of Gilbert Fitzgibbon. Sweet Pamela, it takes quite the talent to have a baby in between all those lovers, a one-way street, voracious Pamela, more than glad to teach her baby. She never did a damn thing right, except become my ex-wife.
She can't take Gilby away from me, can she? He doesn't even know Pamela's his mother.
But she is. She'll argue the mother's righteous claim, and the judge may say he's hers.
Will you please take your case?
That's why you asked me here. But I'm a fool. That's why she asked me. Me, I'm rusty. I spend my days eating and drinking. Too much on my plate.
And then the scene.
Beautiful. Great again to hear you sing that. That particular scene, I remember the rehearsal, the first rehearsal I came to sit in, I was sitting there and you started that aria and the scene, I was like, wow, this is really compelling. I think I'm going to like this. It was interesting, the workshop here at Opera Saratoga was done with very minimal staging. In fact, there was a stage director, but she was really working with the singers on clarification of dramatic beats. There was no set. There were, it was really focusing on what was on the page. And I'm a huge advocate for this. A lot of times opera companies will do workshops and they'll have a director involved and they'll get it up on its feet. And a great director can hide a lot of problems in a work, and a bad director can really mess you up. So I think doing a workshop like this where you're really just relying on what's on the page to see how it works can be really helpful for the process. I'm curious, you were describing how the world of the past is sort of in your vision on a balcony, and you have very clear stage directions. One thing I always say to budding librettists is one of the first things directors tend to do is cross out all the stage directions in a score, which is partially a joke and partially true, because really trying to find out what is embedded theatrically in the text and in the music, and to get their clues about the physicalization of a piece purely from what you've written, not from what you're trying to tell them to do. So I'm curious, from the workshop, did you discover anything about your intentions for ultimately the stage production that were actually very, very clear, or that you feel that you might not need to rely on stage directions as much, where you might want to clarify things inherently in the libretto and the music?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, the takeaway in general, and Maggie Cahill did a wonderful job with the movement on the stage and providing some visual clarity. But what was, for me, the things that worked were, it didn't matter what they were doing. You know, it just, they were standing there singing and everything was conveyed through the acting and the singing, and that was it. They didn't need to be flying anywhere. There were a couple structural things that we were already, you know, changing in one of the scenes that we thought, okay, but actually it was kind of nice because we could sit in on the rehearsal process and say, okay, on the day of the performance, we're just going to enjoy it. But certainly in the rehearsal process leading into it, we came in with a very critical ear and eye. And so I know, like already the fourth scene, you know, things that we're going to restructure. And actually what's nice is that basically what was eye-opening for me, that a lot of the music was there and the text and probably want to convey more, and it wasn't a matter of cutting and adding, it was more rearranging. And actually talking with Maggie Cahill afterwards, she gave a very great point. So I'll give an example of what didn't work. In this fourth scene, we had dead and living and some flashbacks and then multiple flashbacks, and it provided too much confusion because there were all of these very interesting floating orbs, but there was no center of gravity. And the character of Pamela is certainly the reason of all of this contention. And so, oddly enough, she doesn't have an aria. So that's what Josh and I have been working right now, is to give her this stand and plant moment. Then we have now the gravitational pull for the rest of these things to then swirl around and actually make a lot more sense. So that's where the workshop was just incredible, because you couldn't experience that without seeing it the way we did last month. You know.
Do you want to add anything to that?
I think it's hard to describe, but there's a certain way that you don't know your own character until you see an actor reflect it back to you, you know. And so there are definitely some concrete payout things like that fourth scene, the aria we wanted to add at Maggie's suggestion. We actually worked on that this morning until it was time to come here. But there's also a sort of, especially in some of the minor characters, flashback characters, when I saw it sung, I thought, that's just, there's no way of knowing on the page that that's flat until you see it tried out, you know, and you sort of like you build the chair, and then there's that moment when you sit in it and you hope you don't hit the ground, you know, and you sort of, you put a little pressure on it. And the live performance, when you've got a work in front of you on the page, you're free to sit and dwell on that page or to flip them very fast. And in the musical performance, you go through it in real time, and so you really can't discover some of those proportional things until you hear that.
So I see that the next excerpt is called Oysters, Lox, Lobster Salad, which sounds fantastic to me. I don't know if we're having a reception afterwards, but can we talk a little bit about this piece?
Sure. This is the beginning of the final scene of Act One. Roscoe has had his heart attack. In the scene immediately before what we're going to hear, the doctor has spoken to Veronica and he said, you know, he's had this heart surgery. Please see that he stays flat. She says, okay, doc. And then up comes the curtain and we see Roscoe laying in bed, and she brings him a big silver platter with oysters and lox and lobster salad. And it's business as usual, you know, for gluttonous old Roscoe. And you again see their kind of old flame flicker a little bit. And then the scene ends tonight when Alex comes in. There's Veronica's son, who's the mayor, who's, if you know the Albany cycles, or the Erastus Corning archetype. He's going to come and be the mayor home from World War II. So there's this sort of, this is in the air, but this is Veronica tending to Roscoe in his convalescence.
Yeah, and musically, one of the ways we talked about her obviously not diving into, because we see her in that third scene of the grief of her husband, and then how do you get her to gradually sort of rekindle this thing? So getting her big toe wet rather than jumping right in. And so one of the things which is counter to normally how I write, where I take the text and I'll write it and set it, I wanted to write a musical form that was very rigid, so I actually write a canon. So I take this motive that we've heard, this, we've heard numerous times, and put it in something as a rigid structure. And then the singers have to enter in on these pieces. So there's this sense of like they're trying, but they're, constricted by, real world in the plot, as well as this musical entity, not letting them just commit and fall into one another's arms and, all of that stuff. So why don't we show them what that's all about?
get to heaven.
So you like your room?
I like more than my room.
Don't like too much more.
The more you like, the happier you are.
Try to make you happy.
Elijah would want us to be happy. He knew how to be happy.
No, he didn't. He killed himself.
He did it for other people.
For whom?
I don't know yet. I don't want to talk about it. I want a lady finger. Lean on my arm while you feed me.
I can't.
Why not?
It's brazen.
It's not brazen. It's a friendly gesture.
It's more than friendly.
We are more than friends.
Easy, Roscoe. Your heart.
It's already shot.
Do you remember that day?
I remember everything.
It's nothing. We were younger then. Alex is arriving today. I better go down and get ready.
So now the next pieces that we're going to hear are new from the workshop. So this is fresh ink, right? Can you tell us a little bit about these pieces, set them up, and if there's a specific reason why they're new? Are they a result of what you learned at the workshop? Or?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. They were two direct results that we, watching it and seeing how things unfolded. You want to root for the main character from the start, and so we have this sort of mysterious kind of opening with the ill wind off stage, but we get an introduction of Roscoe, but from other people in a sense. And so, as great as that is to see and lively as it opens up, we really wanted to set the stage of the dilemma that Roscoe's in from the start. And so that's where the prologue came about. The other thing was that in that second scene is we don't see Elijah in the beginning until the second scene when he's dead. And so we thought, we actually sat with Bill and went over like, if Roscoe had to say this, how would it go? And so he kind of pointed us in the right direction and give us this clay to work with and mold. And so the prologue was a direct result with that, and an introduction of Elijah, which sadly you'll hear me sing the part of the four measures of Elijah today. And then the second one was a song for Veronica. So we saw how we could get her dramatically from missing her husband to what you saw with the oysters and lox, but we never get what she's feeling. And so that was again another moment with let her have a moment to kind of give us her state of mind and then proceed into the scene you just heard. This is where we went into the song form as well, especially with the prologue, because it's how do you say it's 1945 right away? So we really looked at some Cole Porter songs and how he structured it, Vaughn Monroe, Glenn Miller, you name it, some of these great hits, and then said let's model something to it, but make it Roscoe, and that's sort of what came about. So, good.
Well, that's he's glossing over a wonderful part of the process there, which we really did pick songs and bar for bar steal them, fake them. Where I would sort of syllabically go, word for word. He would go chord for chord and then just turn it, just twist it this much so that it becomes,
Well, there's that line, good composers borrow and great composers steal. So that's...
Yeah.
But we don't say that line in front of copyright lawyers, okay? So, yeah. So why don't we hear the prologue?
Would you believe it if I told you that I, Roscoe Conway, am getting out of politics?
It's a short walk from politics to hell.
Elijah, how are you?
My boy Alex is coming home. How's my old bibbity-bo?
I'm tired.
When's an old soldier gonna call it a day?
Time to say goodbye to politics before I die. Maybe I should call it a day. Election year, Republicans, the governor looking in. Maybe I should call it a day. Time got into me. Maybe I should call it a day.
No, Robert. I'm the one doing the fadeaway. Time's up. And then the opera.
Jessica?
There was a time when Roscoe said he loved me.
So we talked a little bit about what the workshop did for you, and I'm curious as to what your next steps are with this piece.
Yeah, well, fortunately, we were selected as, both Josh and I, as Yaddo residents. So in August, we're going to see, yeah.
Congratulations.
That's great. So we've been mapping out Act 2 and sort of leading up to our time in August, and so our plan is to dive in deep with Act 2. And fortunately, we'll have a couple meetings with Bill while we're at Yaddo and really get kicking it into high gear. So.
Great. Well, I'd love to open up questions from the audience. If you have any questions for Josh or for Evan or for our singers as well, please raise your hand and I'll bring the mic out to you. Oh, come on, there must be some questions. This is such a shy group. Oh, I see one. Okay, let me run back there.
What I don't quite understand is why this is not a musical and is considered an opera.
Great question. So why is this an opera? What is it about its musical and dramatic form, or your choice of singers, or the singing style that we use in opera?
I think for any American composer librettist team, that's a really messy question, because in our country there's sort of this permeable wall between them right now. For me, it's simply, it's not, I think of it as a musical as a bit closer to being a play with incidental music, and an opera as being, it's not at all to disparage it, but the opera is one where the music itself becomes, in a way, the one character that is never off stage. And it does more, I think you said it does some heavy lifting, and I like that idea that it really, for as a librettist, you know, my job is to just basically get the words out of the way. If I try to make a character or explain who a character is, that's not going to work. It's going to be very cumbersome, and that the music can do that a little more in opera because it's simply always there. That's the style.
Yeah, and I think to add on that is that if a character is explaining, that happens all the time in musicals, right? Here I am, this is what I'm doing, this is what it's about, and then, oh, this is what I think of it. And so there are times where you can have really that unwritten moment where the music can say things and comment, and to me, that's where opera really can flourish, where a character actually can say or sing one thing, but what's underneath it, it could be doublespeak, and that's where it's not only a matter of heavy lifting, but really getting the sense of two versions. And I think where opera, the music, the weight of that happens in that genre more than say musical theater.
No, if I can add to it, I think that this particular piece could be confusing in first hearing because the musical style is so, I mean, for lack of a better word, accessible. And I don't, some people say accessible as an insult. I don't say that at all. Very melodic, there's tunes, we're going to walk out humming, and so there are certain things we might associate with musical theater. But you've made a very conscious choice. First, you talked a little bit about how the orchestra role, I like to say that the orchestra tends to play a stronger dramatic role in opera than in most musical theater, though not always the case. But you've intentionally decided to write for unamplified, classically trained voice, and the acoustic voice has certain properties. So what is it about the acoustic voice that attracted you as opposed to going down a musical theater road? Because some of these songs, what Jessica just sung, could be sung by a fantastic music theater singer, and we'd probably enjoy it very much.
Yes.
So what was it about this choice?
Yeah, so absolutely, and even those songs that you just heard, we call them songs rather than arias, and to me that's more of someone's scarf or gloves, not the person, that their DNA. And so for me, I've always been drawn to opera because of the powerful instrument. It's only an opera singer can musically sing something, and I say, get punched in the face, and as an audience member, and all of this intense study in music school and the conservatory and all of this stuff, little by little you almost enjoy less in the sense of you know what's going on. So when you hear these wonderful voices, it packs in the largest impact possible. So I said, this is the instrument I want to write for. So again, and it also I'm not knocking musical theater, but it's like, if I'm going to play on a piano, I want it to be that, not a little upright, So it's the same thing. I want it to be, their voices and the humongous.
Aren't you glad you're not an upright, Jessica? And it's also, I mean, really important to note that what you're hearing tonight is on a piano, and this eventually is going to be orchestrated. The majority, I mean, the largest orchestra you would ever see on Broadway, I think most recently would probably have been the revival of South Pacific at Lincoln Center, which was a 30-some-odd piece orchestra. That's on the small side for opera. The musical resources available to you, although I personally hope you don't write it for a Salome-sized orchestra because it will be very expensive to produce, are just much richer for you as a composer. I would assume that plays into it as well.
For sure. So you can really, you capture the lushness and the enormity of it all through the forces I have. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Other questions?
Are there plans for when it's finished to have a performance at Skidmore or in Saratoga Springs?
Didn't you ask me that question at dinner? I think I asked that. Yeah. Have you been reading my emails to Larry? No. No. Yes, as much as possible. So actually, one of the things we're going to do at Yaddo, we were talking about, in terms of just strategy as being economical, is that we are going to write most of the numbers, that were, the arias or the duets while we're at Yaddo, because then if that's the first thing that needs to be worked out, it's far more mobile, and there are things I can do here as faculty on Skidmore, even using, talented singers in the area, or finding ways through faculty grants to get, Jessica and Mitch back wherever I need. So yes, and that's the hopefully ultimately leading into, a full production. That is the goal, but being smart about it along the way. So without saturating the market too much, as our process unfolds as we write it, absolutely this area is the target place. So.
And in terms of Opera Saratoga, since Evan asked me so directly at dinner this evening, Opera Saratoga has a long history, formerly Lake George Opera, of course, of producing American work and of producing world premieres. While Roscoe's not on the schedule yet because it's not done, I've asked Evan and Josh to certainly keep me apprised of its development. I'm a huge believer that all opera companies should produce new work, and Opera Saratoga is reaffirming its commitment to American work in the future, as you will see as we announce future season schedules. I also run an organization in New York called American Lyric Theater, which is solely dedicated to the development of new work, and I have offered to connect Josh and Evan with other people in the field for other workshop opportunities around the country, because I think this is a piece that definitely deserves the opportunity to grow and flourish. Other questions? All right, well, if there are no other questions, then I want to thank, first of all, Jessica and Mitch for coming back and spending an extra day with us here in Saratoga Springs. And definitely thank Josh and Evan for sharing your wonderful work with us. And I can't not thank William Kennedy for not only writing this fantastic novel, but for granting Evan and Josh permission to adapt it for the opera stage. We're very excited about this project and look forward to seeing the future. Thank you so much for joining us.